Hello and welcome again to this next introductory video to help us prepare for the DigiPlace transnational cluster on the 16th and 17th of June. This video is just going to talk through a little bit more about URBACT Networks as a reminder of the purpose and the structure of them, and just to give us a little intro into what we're going to be expecting as we work together over the next couple of years. So very quickly as a recap, URBACT Networks are about integrated and participative working, and I'll explain a little bit more about what precisely that entails and what that means for us as part of this video. DigiPlace is obviously one of 23 URBACT action planning networks. So the focus is around producing an integrated action plan in each of our cities. So that integrated action plan, or IAP as I'll refer to it, is the main output from each city as part of this network. The final integrated action plans are due in 2022. So we've got time to work through the process to develop those things. And as I say, each DigiPlace city has their own action plan and own local group. So both of those things will be unique to your city, but will be developed in collaboration with other cities in the network and with input from myself and the URBACT Secretariat as we go through. And linked with all of that, we have our transnational exchange and transnational working activities. That'll be through our DigiPlace sessions like these ones. And hopefully, as we get into next year, fingers crossed, some physical face-to-face meetings in our different cities as well. So this whole process through an URBACT network is a journey. It's a journey we're taking together. As we look to see how digital innovation can be developed in our cities and what that means to us and what we want to achieve through our different work programs. In terms of the specifics around URBACT, the local groups, the ULG, we'll talk about that in the ULG workshop session, and I'll introduce that a little bit in the ULG workshop video, which you can check out as well. Likewise, the route to producing that final IAP in 2022, we'll go into the details of what that looks like in the IAP roadmap session around how you're going to create your final integrated action plans. But I'll talk a little bit now about what we mean by integrated action planning and what that product looks like to set the context for what we're trying to do over the next couple of years. So URBACT action planning is about creating change in cities. I think that's the thing we have to remember. We're talking about producing an action plan, but why are we doing that? We're doing that because we're trying to change things in cities. We're trying to create things that are different, things that are better. We're trying to increase the prosperity and the opportunities of both the people and the place as a whole. So it's about creating positive change for cities, and it's important to remember that, because as we go through the detail of these networks, sometimes the individual activities seem a lot like producing particular outputs or particular documents, but the rationale is always about what are we trying to achieve in our cities, what are we trying to change for the better. And that can mean creating change in a number of ways. That's partly about changing our systems, our structures, our procedures, creating intervention programs to change things that happen in our city. But it's also about culture and behaviors. It's about mindset, new ideas, different ways of thinking. And sometimes those softer changes at the bottom there are actually the things that have to come first to enable us to change structures, to enable us to change systems. So the URBACT action planning activities, they're here to start the process of that change, and they're also here to help us create the conditions for effecting that change in a sustainable way. And one thing that's worth noting is that this process of creating an action plan is not a 2-year theoretical exercise. It's not something where we're just writing stuff on paper. We're actually starting the process of making change as we go through it. So these next 2 years will be about building engagement, will be about building momentum in our network and in our cities, our local communities. But also it could be about some quick wins in the meantime. It could be about delivering some tangible, meaningful changes in the short term, as well as planning for our longer term aspirations and our longer term changes through our integrated action plans. So to explore a bit further and just understand, what is this IAP? What is this integrated action plan that we keep talking about? What does that actually mean in practice? What are we looking for as we work towards this product? So I'll take it piece by piece. Looking at the action part of it first, what are we talking about here? We're talking about actions which, when delivered, will create a change in the city. So we're talking about a set of actions that we're designing and putting together to create a specific set of changes that we want to see. Actions are typically small to medium-sized projects. There's no defined scale to an action per se. It's about local context and about what seems to fit and what's appropriate. But on the whole, we tend to find that actions tend to be small projects, medium-sized projects, not normally like one-off tiny little activities. So a typical action might be about setting up a business support hub, or it might be about reskilling a particular part of the community or part of the workforce with some new tools or new skills, for example, just two very small examples. But what we do expect is that they are well defined in terms of what's going to happen, who's going to do them, and so on. So that's the sort of action part, and hopefully that's relatively easy to understand as a concept. Picking up the plan part, again, we're familiar with what a plan is in principle, but what does it mean in this context for us? And what we're trying to do here is say that it's about doing things in a combined and a coherent way. So it's adding in that bit around not just having lots of disparate actions all thrown onto one page just to keep them in one place. It's about designing those actions in a way where they interlink, where they build upon each other or they combine together to create a coherent set of changes that move towards our ultimate objective that we're trying to achieve. So in order for our plans to be delivered in a combined and coherent way, the plan needs to include local context. It needs to set out what we're starting from. And it then also needs to, within that, define what the challenges we're facing or what the problems we're trying to solve at a local level, and being really clear and specific about what they are. So to be combined and coherent, it has to include those things. It then needs to turn that on its head and say, if we're solving these problems, what's the vision for the change you want to see? What's the future look like if we make these changes, if we solve these problems, if we address these challenges? Or equally, if we take opportunities, it's not always just about problems. We can be identifying opportunities that we want to capitalize on, but all that needs to be set out in our vision. Where are we going with this change? And then to be concrete underneath that, what are the specific objectives we want to achieve with indicators of success? How will we know that we've succeeded in those objectives? And then building the route and the plan to delivering those through actions, but smart actions in terms of being specific, being measurable, being actually deliverable, actionable, being relevant and being time bound. So we understand who, what, when, where, how is going to do these actions. And those actions need to fit together in a clear logic model. These actions need to be clearly leading to outputs, which can lead to changes, which can lead to our end results. And that all needs to stack up, and there's to be a clear path as to, we're going to do this and we can show that this is going to achieve the effect we want. And to help us understand how we're progressing and how we're doing, the plan also needs to have performance measures and performance methods in there. How are we going to keep track of what's going on? How are we going to spot if things are going off course and recorrect them? How are we going to know how well we're doing and whether we're getting to where we want to be? And last of all, we also need to have an understanding of what's our implementation approach. So we don't just need to know what we're going to do, what actions we're going to take, but also how we're going to make sure they work effectively. How are we going to get around some of the barriers we typically see to implementation? How are we going to make sure our action plan comes off the page and becomes reality? So that's the sort of action plan side of it. And again, that hopefully is familiar, at least in parts, at least parts of that are familiar. But what about the integrated part? What do we mean by integration? So integration in terms of URBACT and in terms of sustainable urban development, which is what we're dealing with here, goes back to the Leipzig Charter in terms of defining how we look at integration and what we mean by it. And the diagram here shows a few key things around it. There's different sorts of integration that we can look at. The first is horizontal integration, and that's often the most obvious. And that's about cooperation across different policy areas and different departments of a municipality, or potentially out into different partners within a city as well. So it's about working with different organizations and institutions and departments, not just staying within your one function when you're thinking about change and when you're thinking about an action plan. The next is vertical integration. And that's about cooperation at all levels of government. So not just at a municipality level, but potentially at an agglomeration level, or national government, or regional government, or potentially even international bodies as well. Or for example, at EU level. So it's about cooperating where different tiers of government might have different competencies or different pieces of the puzzle in terms of what we want to achieve. Likewise, looking below the municipality level, smaller levels, whether that's about district management or local neighbourhood forums or community groups, or even down to individual citizens or individual businesses, for example. Looking at all levels for the appropriate level of where do we need to think about in terms of the involvement in this action plan, and where do the different actors and different players need to come from in terms of helping us build and design it and deliver it. The third action then is about territorial cooperation. So thinking about difficult or different geographical boundaries. So particularly obvious is cooperating across municipal boundaries with neighboring municipalities or other organizations that cover different territories, for example. Typical ones are looking at functional and economic areas for a city. They're not normally bound by the municipality boundaries, and people may come to work in your city from outside of your municipal boundary. They might use transport that cuts across municipal boundaries or administrative boundaries. So sometimes we need to collaborate and cooperate with other municipalities or other organizations where we are looking at something that goes beyond the geography of our own city. And then all of that needs to be thought about in terms of the balancing of the actions that we're looking at and the measures we're taking as well. So in a particular city, in a particular urban area, it's maintaining the right balance and the right combination between sort of hard investments like physical investments, infrastructure investments, and those softer investments, the social investments that we might make, the social interventions. And it's always about balancing the two. So it's not just about building a park, but it's also thinking about how do people access a park and how do people use that park, for example. So thinking back into the statement we made and thinking about that notion of integration in terms of integrated action plans, that's about thinking about a set of actions that are created in cooperation with all the relevant stakeholders. So that's where the integrated bit comes into the puzzle. So what that then gives us is a situation where we have a set of actions that's created in cooperation with all relevant stakeholders, which when delivered in a combined and coherent way will create the desired changes within our city. And that's what we effectively, in as simple as possible terms, mean by an integrated action plan. It's that notion of having all the different parts coming together in a combined and coherent way. But of course, all the time, it's not just about producing the plan, the document, it's about what that plan is going to achieve. And when we put that plan into action, what change and what benefit is it going to create? And that's a really important thing to keep in mind all the way through this process. So in terms of URBACT, that talks about the integrated aspect of what URBACT's all about. But what about the other part of that, the participative part, which comes in terms of both that cooperation between relevant stakeholders, but also about the delivery in a coherent and combined way as well. So the participative approach in terms of URBACT, the principal tool within the URBACT methodology for that is the URBACT local groups, the ULGs. That's a local group in each city, which allows, is the main engine room for the delivery at a local level and the activity at a local level for URBACT, for DigiPlace. We're going to talk about that in more detail in session 2, where I'll go into the detail of URBACT local groups. The preparatory video for that goes into some of the detail around how the groups work and what the principles are. And in the session, we'll actually have the opportunity to unpick that. But I won't go through any more of that here. Check out the other video and we'll go into it further there and in the session. But it's the principal tool at a local level for URBACT. But the other things we need to consider are sort of mindset, how we think about change, and linked to that, what are the methods we use to effect change? How do we work in a way that includes people in a participative and collaborative way? And those two bits are things that we will look at. You will be doing some of that at the local level already, for sure. Certainly every partner is already doing some of these things, working in a participative way. But we'll be looking to develop that through our transnational work and our exchange, and also within some of the program level work that URBACT will support us with as well, to help us look at things differently and help us work in a different way that allows us to be as participative as we want to be. So that's the sort of overview in terms of the integrated and participative approach to set the context for the URBACT network that we're embarking upon. So it's really just embedding the point that URBACT is about integrated participative working. It's about, we are working in an action planning network. We are moving towards an integrated action plan as the main output by 2022. But the point is that that doesn't mean it's just a theoretical exercise. We're starting some activity in the meantime, and we're using that as to gain momentum. Each city will have its own ULG, which will be the engine for that change and for that momentum in the next 2 years. But we'll all be working towards our own integrated action plan, so 8 in total across the 8 cities in the network. But we will do that in a joined up way across the network, where we can learn and support and share from each other as we go through. So in terms of the details, the ULG session, as I say, will go into the details of what the ULG is and how it works. And the IAP roadmap session will talk about the journey we're going to go through in creating that integrated action plan. So check out those 2 videos for the introduction to those 2 sessions, and we'll get into the detail in the sessions themselves. So thank you very much for listening again, and I'll see you all soon.